"Dad, don't come to the rehearsal dinner. You'll ruin everything with your cane and your wrinkled face. People will think you're sick and pathetic." Those words didn't come from a stranger in the street. They came from my own daughter, the same girl I once carried on my shoulders through Yosemite trails. The child I held through every fever, every heartbreak, every storm of her life. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 72 years old. For more than 4 decades, I was a structural engineer in California, the man who helped design bridges that carry thousands of cars every single day. I've built steel that withstands earthquakes and concrete that outlasts storms. But nothing could prepare me for the moment my own flesh and blood told me that my face, my cane, my very existence was a disgrace to her perfect wedding. I want to pause here and ask you, have you ever had someone you love look you in the eye and say you weren't good enough to stand beside them? Before I continue, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I want to see just how far this story reaches, because what I'm about to tell you will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about family loyalty. You see, I wasn't always the old man with the cane. Years ago, I was known as the guy who built the West Bay Bridge extension, a project that kept commuters moving and economies thriving. I spent long nights on scaffolds, my back bent over blueprints, my mind sharp with calculations. Until one day on site, a steel beam shifted and sent me flying against a support column. The doctors said my spine would never be the same. That was the day the cane became my permanent companion. Vanessa, my daughter, was 16 then. She sat at my hospital bedside, clutching my hand, whispering, "Dad, you're still my hero." For years after, she told everyone that her father was the man who built bridges, the man who never gave up. But somewhere between high school and her engagement to Trevor, that pride twisted into shame. She stopped introducing me as Dad the engineer and started saying only, "This is my father Gerald," like I was an afterthought. Still, I told myself it was just youth, just a phase. Parents always hope. Now here she was, 32, telling me not to attend. The dinner meant to celebrate her marriage because, in her words, I was too wrinkled, too bent, too much of an embarrassment. Her voice on the phone was sharp rehearsed and cruelly certain. She spoke of her future in-laws, the Ashfords, a family dripping with money and appearances. She said they demanded perfection, perfect photos, perfect speeches, perfect optics. And apparently, her 72-year-old father with a cane didn't fit into that flawless picture. I sat in my modest living room as she said it. The very room where I'd once taped her school drawings to the fridge, where I'd stayed up countless nights to help her study algebra, where I'd read her bedtime stories until my eyes burned. The walls seemed to echo with her rejection. You think you're strong until your own child tells you to vanish. You think you've weathered life's storms until betrayal comes not from enemies, but from the one person you raised with every ounce of love in your body. That phone call cut deeper than the steel beam that injured me. At least that accident left visible scars, something people could see. This wound was invisible, but it threatened to hollow me out completely. After I hung up the phone that night, I sat in my recliner, staring at the cane leaning against the wall. That cane was more than polished wood. It was a timeline. Every scratch on it was a memory, the time I leaned on it at Vanessa's high school graduation, the time it kept me steady as I walked her into her dorm room on her first day of college, the time I used it to climb the bleachers so I wouldn't miss her college soccer championship. I remember whispering a silent prayer during that game when my back flared with pain so sharp, it felt like knives in my spine. Lord, give me just enough strength to keep climbing, to keep showing up. And He did. Somehow, I always found the strength. People think engineers are made of numbers and formulas. But bridges aren't just steel and math, they're faith too. Faith that the cables will hold, faith that the foundations won't give way, faith that something you built with your hands will carry people safely long after you're gone. That was how I raised Vanessa, with faith. When her mother passed away from breast cancer, Vanessa was only 9. She cried herself to sleep for months, curled up against my side while I pretended to be strong. But truthfully, I was broken. I went to church every Sunday back then, not for ritual, but for survival. I'd sit in the back pew listening to the hymns, whispering, "Lord, I can build bridges, but I don't know how to build a little girl's broken heart. Help me." And little by little, He did. Vanessa began to smile again. She started bringing me drawings of the Golden Gate Bridge, proudly saying, "This is Daddy's work." I still have those drawings tucked in a folder in my desk. By the time she turned 12, I'd made a promise to myself I would give her everything. Every dollar I earned, every hour of overtime, every ounce of energy. I lived like a monk so she could live like a queen. When other fathers bought new cars, I drove my old Chevy until the wheels squeaked. When my colleagues upgraded their homes, I stayed in the same modest house with faded paint and creaky floors. But Vanessa never wore thrift store clothes. She wore designer brands, the ones her classmates bragged about. She never skipped a school trip, never worried about tuition, never wondered if she could afford an opportunity. I took double shifts, skipped vacations, even cashed out part of my retirement savings, just so she could study abroad in Paris one summer. And do you know what she told people back then? She told them her dad was her hero. She carried that pride like a flag. I'll never forget one night when she was in high school. I was struggling with bills, sitting at the kitchen table with my head in my hands. Vanessa came in, dropped her backpack, and said, "Don't worry, Dad. I'm going to make you proud one day. You'll never regret everything you've done for me." That memory stung me like a fresh wound when she said I'd ruin her rehearsal dinner. Because for years I believed those words. I believed she saw me not just the cane, not just the wrinkles, not just the sacrifices. Looking back, maybe I confused gratitude with love. Maybe I thought if I just kept giving, eventually she would realize that a father's worth isn't in photographs or aesthetics, but in loyalty and showing up in the kind of love that never quits. But faith teaches us something different. Faith teaches us that sacrifice without respect isn't noble, it's wasteful. That night, sitting in my recliner, I whispered another prayer. This one was different. Lord, I thought my job was to keep giving until there was nothing left of me. But maybe you're showing me it's time to stop. Maybe you're reminding me that dignity is sacred and love without respect is not love at all. I didn't sleep much. My mind wandered through memories like old photographs. Vanessa at 5 years old, standing on a chair in the kitchen, stirring pancake batter while flour dusted her hair. Vanessa at 10, holding my hand tightly at her mother's grave. Vanessa at 16, cheering as I limped across the football field for Parent Appreciation Night. She used to see me. She used to love me without conditions. When did that change? Was it gradual like rust creeping along a steel beam, until one day the structure collapses, Or was it sudden like the phone call that shattered everything in one cruel sentence? I didn't have the answer. All I knew was this God hadn't carried me through back injuries, sleepless nights, and decades of sacrifice just so I could end my days in shame hidden away because my daughter was embarrassed by me. No. Something in my soul told me this was a turning point. And as I sat there in the silence, I realized that sometimes when God closes a door, it's not punishment, it's protection. The next morning, my phone buzzed again. Vanessa's name flashed across the screen. For a second, I let myself hope maybe she had thought it over. Maybe guilt had softened her words. But hope is a dangerous thing. "Dad," she said briskly, "I wanted to follow up about what we discussed last night." What we discussed? My voice was low calm. Yes, about the rehearsal dinner. And, well, about the facility. I tightened my grip on the phone. Facility. She sighed like I was a stubborn child. The retirement community, Dad. Trevor and I toured one last week in Palo Alto. It's beautiful. Private rooms, medical care activities. You'd be comfortable there. And she hesitated, then pressed on, it would make things easier. For us, for you, I corrected. Her tone hardened. Dad, you don't understand how important appearances are. The Ashfords have very high standards. Their friends, their colleagues, everyone will be watching. A frail man with a cane doesn't fit. There it was again. Fit. As if her father were a puzzle piece that no longer belonged in her picture. Vanessa, I said slowly, do you hear yourself? You're asking me to disappear because your fiancé's family might frown at a wrinkle or a limp. It's not just them, she snapped. It's everything. The photographer, the videographer, the social media posts. This wedding has to be perfect. Perfect. I had heard that word before. Back when she was 10 and demanded the perfect Halloween costume. Back when she was 16 and wanted the perfect car for prom. And every time I worked myself ragged to give her what she wanted. But this was different. This was erasing me. I looked around my modest living room, the sagging couch, the outdated wallpaper, the old Chevy keys on the table. It was easy to see why Vanessa thought I was just a worn-out old man with nothing to show for a lifetime of labor. What she didn't know was upstairs in a locked filing cabinet sat the proof of a life carefully, quietly built. 5 property deeds. The first a duplex in Oakland I bought in 1985 for $92,000, now worth over $1.2 million. The second, a commercial building near San Jose I picked up in 1998 when the tech bubble scared everyone else away. The third, a small vineyard parcel outside Napa purchased after her mother's funeral when I needed something solid to hold on to. Add to that an apartment complex I acquired during the foreclosure crisis and a beachfront rental I bought in 2010 with my entire savings. Together, they generated steady rental income enough to cover every bill, every medical expense, and then some. My portfolio of stocks and bonds wasn't small either. 4 decades of careful investing, automatic contributions, and living below my means had compounded into millions. The last time I tallied it, my net worth stood at $5.2 million. Vanessa never knew. I wanted her to grow up grateful, not entitled. I wanted her to learn character before she learned inheritance. But hearing her voice on the phone now demanding I tuck myself away in a facility like some discarded relic, I realized I had failed. "Dad, are you listening?" she asked. "I'm listening," I said quietly. "Good. because Trevor's parents offered to cover the first year's cost. We just need you to agree. Think of it as a fresh start. A fresh start. For whom, for them, living picture perfect lives while I was hidden away. Vanessa, I said slowly, do you remember when you were 16 and I stood in the rain for 3 hours because you forgot your cleats at home? Do you remember when you called me crying from Paris and I wired you money within the hour? Do you remember when I worked 3 straight months of double shifts to pay your tuition? She was silent. All of that was for you, I continued. Every sacrifice, every dollar, every hour, and now you want me out of sight, out of mind. Her reply was cold. Dad, gratitude doesn't change the fact that you don't belong in this new chapter of my life. Something inside me snapped. I ended the call, staring at the phone in my hand. The silence of the house felt heavy, oppressive. My cane leaned against the armrest, but suddenly it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a weapon not for striking, but for standing tall. I realized something crucial in that moment. Vanessa didn't just want me gone. She thought I was powerless. She thought the man who had built bridges, who had raised her alone, who had quietly amassed a fortune, was nothing more than a frail shadow. She had no idea who her father really was. And soon she would. I put the phone down slowly, as if it had turned into something toxic. The air in my living room felt heavy, suffocating. Outside, the neighborhood kids rode their bikes laughing in the sunshine, while inside my own daughter had just sentenced me to exile. Do you know the strangest part? It wasn't the words that cut deepest. It was the tone. Calm, businesslike. Like she was arranging flowers or ordering cake samples. She didn't even realize she was dismantling 32 years of fatherhood in one neat conversation. I stared at the photos on the wall. Vanessa at 6, missing her 2 front teeth, holding the Golden Gate Bridge drawing she was so proud of. Vanessa at 12, blowing out candles while I stood behind her with frosting still on my shirt because I'd rushed straight from work. Vanessa at 22, tossing her graduation cap into the air, her future wide open. And now Vanessa at 32, deciding her father no longer belonged in her picture-perfect life. The realization hit me like cold water. This wasn't sudden. The signs had been there for years. When she introduced me to her college friends, she skipped the stories of bridges I'd built and said only, "This is my dad, Gerald." When Trevor first came around, she told him I was retired on a budget, hiding me like a faded relic instead of the man who sacrificed everything for her. Even last Christmas, she insisted on hosting dinner at their penthouse because, in her words, "Your house feels too small for the Ashfords." I had excused it all as vanity, as youth, as temporary distance. But now I saw the truth. My daughter had been rewriting me for years, erasing the hero she once adored, and replacing him with the embarrassment she now disowned. I reached for the cane beside me, my hand wrapping around its familiar grooves. This piece of wood had kept me upright through storms of pain. And I thought maybe it wasn't just holding me steady. Maybe it was a reminder that strength comes not from appearance, but from endurance. My daughter believed she was burying me in a nursing home, but she had no idea she had just resurrected something inside me. The man who built bridges hadn't disappeared. He had only been sleeping. I walked slowly to my study upstairs, each step a declaration. The key turned in the filing cabinet, and the drawers opened to reveal the life she never cared to ask about. Property deeds, investment portfolios, insurance policies, A quiet empire worth over $5 million accumulated by sacrifice and strategy. Vanessa had told me I didn't belong in her new chapter. What she didn't realize was this: I held the pen. And that's when the anger began to cool into something sharper. Resolve. Let me ask you, because maybe you've been here too. What would you do if your own child told you to disappear? If the very person you sacrificed for treated you like a blemish to be erased from their perfect life? Would you bow your head, accept the insult, and fade quietly into the background? Or would you stand tall, even if it meant leaning on a cane, and remind them exactly who you are and what you've built? I want to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments what you would do, because stories like mine are not just mine. They belong to anyone who has ever been betrayed by their own blood. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because trust me, this story is only beginning. And in the next chapter, my daughter will learn a truth she never imagined. The father she called pathetic is far from powerless. The morning after that call, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Betrayal has a strange way of sharpening the mind. You spend decades convincing yourself to ignore little cuts until one day the knife goes in deep enough to wake you up completely. I brewed a pot of coffee stronger than usual and carried the mug into my study. The filing cabinet sat there like an old friend waiting. I pulled the key from my keychain, slid it into the lock, and opened the drawers. Paper rustled beneath my fingers, decades of choices. Deeds, statements, policies. To anyone else, it might have looked like boring paperwork, but to me, it was a chronicle of sacrifice. Proof that every overtime shift, every vacation skipped, every second-hand jacket had built something lasting. Vanessa had dismissed me as an old man with a cane. She had no idea that her pathetic father could buy and sell her fiancé's family 3 times over. That thought should have made me bitter. Instead, it made me smile. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. Jonathan Blackwood came the familiar voice. My estate attorney. Jonathan. I said steady and calm, it's Gerald Whitmore. We need to meet. Today. By noon, I was sitting in his mahogany-paneled office, the same office where 15 years ago, I drafted a will, leaving everything to Vanessa. Back then, it had felt like security. Today, it felt like a mistake. I wanted changed, I told him flatly. Jonathan adjusted his glasses. Changed how? Completely. Vanessa is to be excluded. Every asset, the properties, the investments, the accounts will go to the Veterans Housing Trust when I pass. They'll use it to build homes for men who fought for this country and came back with nothing. At least they'll respect what's given to them. Jonathan studied me. That's a substantial estate, Gerald. Are you certain? I leaned forward. My daughter told me I don't belong in her life anymore. She made her choice. Now I'm making mine. He nodded slowly. Then we'll make it ironclad. I also recommend a video statement in case there's ever a contest. Good, I said. I want the world to know exactly why. 2 hours later, my new will was signed, sealed, and witnessed. For the first time in years, I walked out of that office feeling not old, not weak, but powerful. But money alone wasn't the lesson my daughter needed. She needed to see with her own eyes who she had thrown away. So the next stop was transformation. I drove to San Francisco's Union Square and stepped into a salon whose windows gleamed like crystal. The receptionist looked me over with a polite smile that carried the faintest trace of judgment until I gave my name and appointment. Marcus, the stylist, greeted me with a handshake. firm enough to remind me I was still a man. He trimmed my silver hair, shaped my beard, and studied my scars with the eye of an artist rather than a critic. "These tell a story," he said quietly. "We'll make them part of your strength." When he spun me toward the mirror an hour later, I barely recognized the man staring back. Distinguished. Sharp. The cane no longer looked like a weakness, but an accessory like the polished umbrella of an old statesman. From there I walked 3 blocks to an Italian tailor. "Charcoal gray," I told him. "Wool. Custom." He measured me with precise hands, clucking softly at my posture. A week later, I would return to pick up a suit that draped over me like it was born from my skin. On impulse, I opened the old safe in my study that evening and pulled out a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a Rolex Submariner gifted to me on my 50th birthday by the bridge company board. I had worn it once, then tucked it away because I didn't want Vanessa to grow up thinking appearances mattered more than character. Now I strapped it on. It ticked against my wrist like a heartbeat returning. And finally, the car. In my garage sat a 1967 Bentley S3, a relic from my father-in-law's estate. I'd kept it covered for decades, telling myself it was impractical. That afternoon, I pulled the cover away and ran my hand along its glossy curve. When the engine roared to life, deep and smooth, I felt 20 years younger. I knew where I was going to drive it. Vanessa wanted me hidden. She wanted me small. Instead, I would arrive at her rehearsal dinner at the Ritz-Carlton, not as the frail embarrassment she imagined, but as the man she never bothered to know. And when I left, she would understand exactly what she had thrown away. The suit was ready a week later. Charcoal gray cut to perfection, with shoulders that straightened me even when my back refused. When I tried it on in front of the mirror for the first time in decades, I didn't see the scars, the cane, or the slump. I saw a man of stature, a man who had survived, endured, and built. And yet, as I stood there tying the Windsor knot with trembling fingers, a whisper of doubt crept in. What if they still see only the scars? What if they laugh? What if I walk in, and instead of dignity, I become a spectacle? I set the tie down and sat heavily on the edge of my bed. The Bentley keys lay on the nightstand beside my Bible, untouched since Sunday service the month before. For a long moment I stared at that worn leather cover. Then I reached for it. The pages fell open to a verse I had underlined years ago during my recovery from the accident. "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." I closed my eyes. Weakness. That was what Vanessa saw. But strength was what God had built inside me all these years, brick by brick, prayer by prayer. I whispered aloud in the room still around me, "Lord, I don't ask you for revenge. I don't ask you to change Vanessa's heart tonight. I ask for dignity. Give me the courage to stand tall even with a cane. Let me walk into that room, not as a monster or a burden, but as the man you know I am. If this is the last time my daughter sees me, let her see the truth before the curtain closes." Peace washed over me slowly, like the tide creeping up a shoreline. The doubts didn't vanish, but they lost their grip. I rose, buttoned the suit jacket, and fastened the Rolex around my wrist. Its steady tick reminded me that time is the one currency we can't buy back, and I had no intention of spending what remained apologizing for my existence. Later that evening, I drove the Bentley out of the garage for the first time in 30 years. The engine purred like a lion, the leather seats firm yet forgiving beneath me. As I steered through the streets of San Francisco, heads turned. Some smiled with admiration, others with envy. But no one saw a broken old man. They saw a presence. At a stoplight, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Silver hair, neat beard scars softened by years, yet still bold across my skin. For so long I had tried to hide them, angling my face away from cameras, pulling at collars to cover what I could. Tonight I let them show, because they weren't marks of shame. They were the price of saving another man's life. They were evidence of survival. And in the light of faith, scars are not disfigurements, they are testimonies. By the time I reached the bay, the city lights glittered like jewels on the water. I pulled the Bentley over, stepped out carefully with my cane, and let the night air fill my lungs. I remembered Vanessa as a little girl tracing the lines of my scars with her tiny fingers and saying, "These make you look brave, Daddy." Somewhere along the way, that child had been replaced by a woman who saw only imperfection. But maybe that was the point. Maybe God had allowed this fracture not to punish me, but to free me. To remind me that love without respect is not love, and that dignity is sacred even when family tries to strip it away. I stood there by the water cane planted firm on the pavement, and whispered one final prayer: "Lord, if tonight ends with me walking away forever, let me walk away with peace. If tonight ends with tears, let them be hers, not mine. And if tonight ends with silence, let that silence speak louder than any words I could say." The Bentley's headlights cut across the waves as I slid back into the driver's seat. Ahead of me, the Ritz-Carlton rose like a fortress of glass and light, where chandeliers would gleam, champagne would flow, and my daughter would be playing the role of perfect bride-to-be. And soon I would walk through those doors. Not as the embarrassment she tried to erase, but as the living proof that no amount of rejection can erase the worth God Himself placed inside a man. The Ritz-Carlton ballroom glowed like a jewel box that evening. Crystal chandeliers rained light across marble floors, and waiters in white gloves glided between tables carrying silver trays of champagne. A string quartet filled the air with delicate notes of Mozart. Everything screamed money, perfection, elegance. I pulled the Bentley into the valet circle, the engine's low growl turning more than a few heads. The valet boy's jaw slackened when he saw me step out, silver hair, combed back suit, cut sharp across my shoulders. Rolex gleaming beneath the cuff. He reached for my cane as if I couldn't handle it myself. I smiled and shook my head. "It's not a burden, son. It's part of me." Walking through those glass doors, cane tapping in rhythm against the marble, I could feel eyes on me. Guests in sequined gowns and black tuxedos turned, murmuring their gazes, following me as though I were someone important. Not a single one recognized me as the frail embarrassment my daughter had described. The room hushed when Vanessa and Trevor entered at the far end. She wore a satin cocktail dress, flawless hair, perfect makeup, her smile rehearsed to dazzle. But when her eyes swept the crowd and landed on me, the smile faltered. Just for a heartbeat enough for me to see the shock ripple across her face. She recovered quickly, clinging tighter to Trevor's arm, but I caught the way her lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't expected me, and certainly not like this. I didn't rush to her. I let the evening unfold. I took a seat near the front, within clear view of the head table. Waiters poured champagne into my glass without hesitation, assuming I belonged among the elite. For once, I let them assume correctly. Toasts began. Trevor's father droned on about family honor and legacy, His mother Victoria gushed about appearances and perfection. Then Vanessa rose, thanking everyone for their support. She never once mentioned me. I waited until the applause faded. Then, cane in hand, I rose slowly to my feet. The room stilled. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying across the marble like steel striking stone, "my name is Gerald Whitmore. I am Vanessa's father." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Vanessa's eyes widened. Trevor's grip on her arm tightened. "I came tonight," I continued, "not for recognition, but for truth. My daughter once told me I was her hero. Last week she told me I was an embarrassment, that I didn't belong in her perfect world." Gasps erupted around the tables. All eyes turned to Vanessa. Her face flushed crimson. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a cream-colored envelope heavy with weight. Her name was written across the front in elegant calligraphy. "This," I said, holding it aloft, "is my gift. Not flowers, not money, not a speech. The truth." I stepped forward and pressed the envelope into her trembling hands. She clutched it as though it might burn her. Trevor frowned. "Mr. Whitmore, perhaps this isn't the but," I cut him off with a raised hand. "Young man, you may have wealth, you may have standing, but you don't have history. 32 years of scraped knees, late-night homework tears wiped away, and sacrifices no one else saw. That's what I gave her. And this letter will show her what she gave me in return." The quartet had gone silent. Guests leaned forward, breath held. Even the waiters froze. Vanessa tried to speak, her lips moving without sound. Finally, she whispered, "You look so different." I smiled, not cruelly, but with finality. It's amazing what dignity looks like when you stop hiding it. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. I tapped my cane once against the floor, the sound echoing like a gavel. "Enjoy your perfect evening," I said. "It will be memorable, though perhaps not in the way you intended." Then I turned, walked through the stunned crowd, and headed for the exit. Behind me, whispers rose like a storm, "Millionaire father, embarrassment." The last thing I saw before stepping out into the cool night was my daughter frozen in place, the envelope trembling in her hands, her perfect mask cracking. She had wanted me invisible. Instead, I had become unforgettable. The night air outside the Ritz was cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of the bay. My cane clicked against the marble steps as I descended, slow but deliberate. Behind me, the murmur of chaos began to rise, the perfect harmony of the rehearsal dinner unraveling thread by thread. I didn't need to look back. I knew what was happening inside. Vanessa stood frozen at the head table, the envelope shaking in her hands, the calligraphy letters of her own name mocking her. Trevor leaned toward her, demanding answers. His parents whispered furiously to each other, their carefully painted smiles curdling into suspicion. Guests craned their necks, wondering how the polished gentleman who'd just walked out could possibly be the same pathetic father they'd been told about. By the time I reached the Bentley, the valet practically ran to meet me, fumbling the keys into my hand with a reverence I hadn't felt in years. I slipped into the leather seat, closed the door with a soft thud, and let the engine purr to life. Through the windshield, I saw faces pressed against the ballroom windows, curiosity, confusion, dawning horror. I smiled faintly. Inside, I imagined Vanessa tearing open the envelope, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling as she unfolded the letter. She would read the first lines and feel the blood drain from her face. "My dear Vanessa, by the time you read this, you will realize what you have lost. Not just your father's presence, but his legacy. For 32 years, I lived simply driving old cars and wearing worn shoes, so you could live as if we were rich. What you never knew was that behind the simplicity stood an empire worth over $5 million. An empire I intended for you until you told me I no longer belonged in your life. The whispers in the room would grow louder. Trevor's mother, Victoria, would seize the page, her eyes scanning frantically, her voice sharp. 5 million. How could you not know? Trevor himself, pride-wounded, would snap at Vanessa, demanding why she had lied about her father being a broke retiree. The Ashfords prided themselves on legacy, on marrying into wealth and prestige. And in one instant, they would realize they had not gained it, they had driven it away. As I guided the Bentley onto California Street, I pictured Vanessa's face pale beneath the makeup, her perfect evening dissolving into ashes. She had wanted perfection. Instead, she now stood at the center of a spectacle, every guest whispering not about her dress or her flowers, but about the fortune she had thrown away with one cruel sentence. That was the justice. Not shouting, not public humiliation by my hand, just the quiet reveal of truth, undeniable, irreversible. A few blocks away, I parked briefly beneath a street lamp and pulled out my phone. One missed call already blinked across the screen. Vanessa, then another Trevor. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. Let them stew. The truth is, walking away didn't feel like defeat. It felt like freedom. For decades, I had been tethered to the idea that love meant staying no matter the disrespect. But stepping into the night, leaving them to their whispers and their panic, I finally understood. Sometimes the strongest love is the kind that refuses to enable cruelty. Back at the Ritz, no doubt the envelope was still making its rounds. Each guest would want to see it to confirm the scandal with their own eyes. Each would calculate silently what $5 million could have meant, and how Vanessa's arrogance had cost her everything. By the time I merged onto the highway, the phone buzzed again and again. Calls, texts, desperate attempts to reel me back in. I ignored them all. The Bentley hummed beneath me, smooth and unbothered, as if carrying me not just away from the hotel, but from an entire lifetime of being diminished. I didn't drive home. Home no longer felt like a destination. Instead, I steered toward the coastline where waves smashed against rocks and the wind tore through the night. I pulled over, stepped out, and planted my cane firmly on the gravel. The ocean roared approval. I breathed deep, the salt air cleansing my lungs, and whispered into the darkness, "It's done." Behind me, Vanessa's perfect world was collapsing under the weight of truth. Ahead of me stretched the open road, the beginning of a new life. And in that moment, I knew I hadn't lost a daughter. I had shed a burden. 6 months later, the Pacific stretched out before me like a sheet of molten silver waves crashing against the cliffs below my terrace. The morning sun broke through a blanket of mist, casting my new home in Carmel by the sea in golden light. I sat on a wrought iron chair cane, resting beside me, a cup of fresh coffee steaming in my hand. The house behind me was not modest. White stucco walls, terracotta roof tiles, arched windows that caught the ocean's light, a $3.4 million villa I had purchased. Outright, no mortgage, no strings. The neighbors were retired CEOs, doctors, and artists who spent their mornings walking dogs along the coast and their evenings sipping wine as the sky turned purple. And me, just another gentleman who had worked hard and was finally enjoying what life had to offer. I had no intention of telling them the truth, that I was also the father a daughter had branded an embarrassment, then abandoned. Out here I was simply Gerald, a man who played golf at Pebble Beach on Tuesdays, attended book club on Thursdays, and hosted small dinners where laughter filled the rooms instead of judgment. The phone calls had stopped weeks ago. At first, Vanessa rang every day, her messages tumbling over each other with apologies, excuses, pleas. I ignored them. Then Trevor's voice appeared on voicemail, brittle with frustration. Do you realize what you've done to Vanessa? You humiliated her. You destroyed our wedding. I deleted it without hesitation. By the third month, the calls dwindled. By the fourth, silence. Buddy, the old friend who'd known me since my engineering days, called sometimes to keep me updated, though I never asked. He told me Vanessa's marriage was crumbling. Trevor's family, furious over the revelation, had turned cold. Victoria, the matriarch, apparently told anyone who would listen that her son had married into a family with no class. Trevor filed for separation soon after. The marriage, Buddy said, had lasted less than a year. I felt no joy in that news, only clarity. She had chosen appearances over loyalty, and appearances had abandoned her. One evening, while sipping a glass of Napa Cabernet on my terrace, I thought back to that night at the Ritz-Carlton. How the chandeliers had sparkled, how every guest had gasped when I revealed the truth. But what stayed with me most wasn't the spectacle. It was the silence that followed my exit. That silence had been louder than any speech I could have given. Now in Carmel, my days were filled with a different kind of silence, the good kind. The kind that hummed with the rhythm of waves, the chatter of gulls, the rustle of pages in a well-worn book. Neighbors greeted me warmly, not because they wanted something, but because community was built into this place. Mrs. Donnelly, a retired piano teacher, often dropped by with fresh scones. Richard, a widower like me, invited me to join his fishing trips. Sarah, a former professor with a laugh that could brighten any room, sometimes joined me for walks along the shore. These people didn't see a monster or a burden or a blemish on their photographs. They saw me, just me, and for the first time in decades, that was enough. I often thought about the fortune I had redirected in my will. The Veterans Housing Trust had already broken ground on its first project with my funds, 50 small homes, for men who had served and returned with scars no one applauded. That I realized was legacy. Not a spoiled daughter's inheritance, but roofs over the heads of men who understood sacrifice. Some evenings I still opened my Bible. The verse I had clung to after the accident returned to me. My strength is made perfect in weakness. It no longer felt like a lifeline. It felt like a truth etched into my life. Because in losing what I thought mattered most, I had gained what truly mattered: peace, dignity, freedom. It was a Sunday evening when I finally realized what peace truly felt like. The sun was sinking into the horizon, painting the Pacific in streaks of fire and gold. I sat on the terrace with Sarah and Richard, two of my new friends, sipping coffee while the waves rolled below us. Beautiful, isn't it? Sarah said, her voice soft against the roar of the ocean. Yes, I replied, watching the colors bleed across the sky. Beautiful and honest. The ocean doesn't pretend. It crashes, it recedes, it returns. Always the same, always itself. That was something I had learned late in life, to be myself without apology, without begging for approval. After my guests left, I stayed outside alone, my cane resting beside me, the night air cool against my face. I opened my Bible, flipping to the page I had marked, after the wedding debacle. Psalms 147:3 stared back at me. He healeth the broken in heart, and bindeth up their wounds. For a long time I stared at those words, because that was what had happened to me. My heart had been broken by the very daughter I once thought would carry my legacy. But God had bound up those wounds, not by fixing what was lost, but by showing me I didn't need her approval to be whole. Vanessa still tried to reach me, Buddy told me. Letters, voicemails, even a private investigator. But each attempt bounced against the walls I had built, not out of hatred, but out of necessity. Because forgiveness is one thing, but reconciliation requires respect. And respect was something she had thrown away with her cruel words. People sometimes ask if I regret it, walking away, cutting her out of my will, choosing strangers over blood. And my answer is simple: blood alone doesn't make family. Loyalty does, respect does, love does. Family should never be a place where you are diminished. If it becomes that, then maybe God is telling you it's time to walk away. I thought back to the night of the rehearsal dinner. The look on Vanessa's face when she realized who I truly was. The ripple of whispers through the room. The way the silence swallowed everything when I walked out. That silence had been my victory. Not cruelty, not revenge. Just truth revealed. And I had carried that truth into my new life. Now every morning when I wake up to the ocean air, I remember dignity is sacred. Respect isn't optional. And love, if it isn't mutual, is just exploitation in disguise. To anyone listening right now, let me say this. You are not obligated to accept abuse, even from family. You are not required to shrink yourself to fit someone else's picture of perfection. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from the people who treat you as less than you are. God doesn't call us to live as doormats. He calls us to live with strength, with self-respect, with dignity. And sometimes His greatest blessings come disguised as betrayal. Vanessa lost a father that night, though she didn't realize it. She lost $5 million she thought never existed. She lost the legacy I had built with my bare hands. But me, I gained something priceless. Peace. And let me tell you, peace tastes better than champagne, feels richer than silk, and shines brighter than any chandelier at the Ritz-Carlton. So I raise my glass tonight, not to what was lost, but to what was found, to second chances, to dignity, to the strength God gives us to walk away when we've been treated as disposable. Now I want to ask you, because this story isn't just mine. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family to protect your peace? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your story because your voice matters too. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story like this. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Maybe they're sitting in the same kind of silence I once did, wondering if they're allowed to choose themselves. The answer is yes. You are allowed. You are worthy. And you are stronger than you think.